Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Oni, a third-person action title developed by Bungie West and published by Gathering of Developers for Microsoft Windows and Mac OS back in 2001, with a port to the PlayStation 2 following later that same year. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 104, and it is another special episode because it is a Patreon-sponsored episode. This one sponsored by Rich Senewald. Rich did record a message for everybody to listen to, so Rich, take it away.
Oh my god, Oni. I don't have a huge amount to say about this because I came across this game entirely by chance about 2002, 2003, so it'd already been out for a year or two at the time, and I was at a local game store. I think it was called Pink Planet. In Cheltenham in England. And I was trading in some games and I was grabbing Time Splitters 2 at the time for the PlayStation. And I got in the car, well, not my car, I couldn't drive at that point, but I got in the car to go home and I was like opening up the CD cases you do, dead excited, I want to look at the manual while Dad drives. I was like, oh, shit, the wrong CD's in here. And I had to go back to the shop because they'd put the wrong CD in the case, and the guy was not very helpful. And he was just like, well, you know, just you have to grab something else instead, and didn't really want anything. I picked up Oni because the lady on the cover looked like, is it Kanoko from Ghost in the Shell? Had serious Ghost in the Shell vibes. I was a big fan of like Akira, Ghost in the Shell at that point as well. And a couple of other games because they were quite cheap because they'd been out for a while. And this one was for the PC. I put it in my PC, loaded it up. That was amazing. It was so good. And I knew nothing about it other than it was Bungie, who I hadn't really heard of too much at that point. Other than, obviously, Halo, which I was a launch buyer of the Xbox. So I had Halo. I played Halo a lot in co-op, in link-up, and everything. And I was like, it's Bungie. That's pretty cool. And yeah, I don't really have anything else to add to this game. It was just so good. The combat was amazing. It was unlike anything else I'd played at the time. I loved sort of third-person fighting games, visceral beat-em-ups. I loved games like this. Was Splinter Cell out at that point? It must have been. Loved games like Splinter Cell. With the stealth element, the Metal Gear Solid style games. So this kind of threw all of that together and then threw a ass ton of action into it as well. It reminded me kind of like a third person siphon filter, final fight type, everything with like manga anime graphics. Oh, it was amazing. And I don't really know anyone else who'd heard of this. Like it hadn't been on anyone's radar who I'd met in a very long time. And yeah, I played this game just start to finish, just non-stop. And the very final boss fight, my game crashed and corrupted just right at the end. So I've never actually completed it. I got right to the end. I remember like a helicopter battle on at the top of a building or something like that. The whole thing was massively cinematic. The storyline was awesome. You just have to play it. It's just a complete wild card of a game. That just lives in my memory of being such a good experience, and at the time, so unlike anything else. So yeah, enjoy it. And Tony, I know you enjoyed this. You must have. It's so, just like I said, it's a wild card.
Thank you, Rich, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. If you would like to sponsor an episode or just get in touch with me to talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of classic gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Oni. Oni is a third-person action title developed by Bungie West and published by Gathering Developers for Microsoft Windows and Mac OS in 2001, with a port to the PS2 following later that year. Before we can talk about Oni, we need to take a step back and talk about the game's creator, Bungie West, itself an offshoot of the much more well-known studio Bungie, a company with a significant legacy in video game history that is still actively being written, even today, with countless beloved titles released over the course of the last 3 decades, many of which represented the state-of-the-art in video game design at the point they were released. Bungie didn't just spring into existence as a mammoth game development studio, though. As with many eventual legendary development studios, Bungie's origins started with a single person, and in this case, that person was University of Chicago student Alex Seropian. Seropian had been interested in video games and by extension computer programming from a very young age, having grown up in the 70s and 80s, a period of time when the video game industry was really starting to expand in popularity. When Seropian decided to enter college in the late 80s, he knew that he wanted to continue developing his programming skills. Only here, there was one slight problem. Seropian's chosen college, the University of Chicago, didn't offer undergraduate degrees in computer science, which meant he couldn't technically major in that subject area. Instead, he decided to major in mathematics with a concentration in computer science, which effectively meant he was still able to take a bunch of software programming courses. He just wouldn't ultimately have a degree at the end of his college career that said computer science on it. A slight disappointment, but not a huge deal, as Seropian figured that regardless of what his degree said, he was going to become a computer programmer. While attending college, Seropian spent his free time pursuing his software development interests, and in 1990 would create his very first game, a Pong clone entitled Gnop, or Nop, which is cleverly enough Pong spelled backwards. Created on the Apple Macintosh, Nop would be designed to mostly mimic Atari's original Pong title, with black and white graphics, a simple paddle and ball graphics scheme, and simplistic physics that would facilitate the back and forth ping-ponging of the ball from one side of the screen to the other. Unlike Pong though, Nop would add in higher quality sound effects, and would tweak the scoring to make it so that only the serving player could score points. Obviously, these were not huge changes to the Pong formula, but they showed that Seropian, beyond simply wanting to recreate the original experience, was also trying to innovate on that formula, a sure sign that he was looking for ways to advance beyond mimicry and instead shift towards original creation. After developing Nop, Seropian would turn his attention back to school, and as part of his continued coursework, would sign up for an artificial intelligence class in the hopes of improving his ability to create computer-controlled characters for future games. It turns out that artificial intelligence class would end up providing Seropian with a serendipitous opportunity, as it was during that AI course that he would meet a fellow talented software developer, a man by the name of Jason Jones. While Seropian had always had an interest in software development, Jason Jones was a hardcore programmer through and through, and from a very early age had been teaching himself how to develop rudimentary computer games, eventually learning how to code using both user-friendly programming languages like Apple Basic, as well as more machine-level technologies like assembly language, which is effectively as close as most programmers can get to controlling, directly, the hardware within a computer. Assembly is not for the faint of heart, but in the mid-80s, that was the name of the game if you wanted to create efficient, high-performance applications, and Jones loved learning the ins and outs of how to make his Apple II computer bend to his will. This experimentation would eventually lead Jones to create a prototype for an advanced, at least for the time, maze action title where players could connect to each other using modems and experience multiplayer competitive combat, in a time when multiplayer anything typically required sitting next to each other on a sofa in your living room. A distributed multiplayer title was certainly an advanced concept for 1988, but Jones wouldn't take this idea beyond the working prototype stage. Keep this prototype in the back of your mind though, because we will be revisiting it in just a little bit. Anyway, by the time he graduated from high school, Jones had become so proficient in computer programming that he decided to forego college entirely, at least for the time being, and instead would join a company to develop computer-aided design or CAD applications for use on personal computers. Jones spent around a year in that job, continuing to develop his skill set before he decided to return to academia and enroll in the University of Chicago, with the ultimate goal of graduating and eventually entering the video game industry. While there, he would meet Alex Seropian while attending a course on artificial intelligence, and soon after, the two would develop a strong friendship, driven primarily by the fact that both men shared a common interest in computer programming. Seropian was a couple years ahead of Jones, so while Jones continued to attend classes, Seropian was in the process of finishing up his coursework, and in 1991 would become a member of the University of Chicago's graduating class. After graduating, Seropian wasn't sure exactly what he should do next. He knew he needed a job, but he wasn't sure if he wanted to get a standard programming job somewhere to allow him to build up his resume and his skill set, or if he should just cut to the chase and enter the video game industry, which is where his true passion lied. One summer afternoon, while lounging on a couch in his parents' house, he brought his major life decision to his father, seeking advice. His father, having a fairly traditional mindset, told his son that he should get a regular, stable job and forget about the whole video game thing, which seemed to be a fickle and potentially more risky career path. Seropian, like many young men with their whole lives in front of them, decided to do the exact opposite of his father's advice, and literally the day following that conversation, decided to create his own video game company, Bungie Software Products Corporation. Shortly after deciding to create a new company, Seropian realized that he had to actually release some games if he hoped to make a living creating video games. And here, luckily, he had the start of a game catalog just waiting to go. The Pong clone he created while at college, Nop, was already complete and ready to ship, so Seropian made some final tweaks and released it to the public. And in the process, Nop became the first game ever released by Bungie, at least unofficially. You see, at this point, Bungie hadn't yet become a true incorporated company, so the game was effectively self-published by Seropian, using Bungie as a moniker to make the game sound a bit more professional than simply saying published by Alex Seropian, which honestly, I tend to agree with. Interestingly, despite the game being quote-unquote published by Bungie, Seropian would end up releasing the game for free, which you might think would be counterintuitive if your goal is to, make money. But here, Seropian had a different concept in mind. He realized that the chances of someone buying a black and white Pong clone in 1991 was probably non-existent, so he decided to release the game for free, but would also offer the source code behind the game for $15, a move he hoped would generate some income to allow him to focus on creating his next game. While I couldn't find sales figures for the NOP source code, it must have sold well enough to at least keep the lights on as Seropian worked on his next title, the first commercially available Bungie game, Operation Desert Storm, which released on the Apple Macintosh in June of 1991. Operation Desert Storm was a tops-down two-dimensional tank combat game that tasked players with moving around a maze-like battlefield, avoiding enemy fire, and defeating enemies along the way. Over the course of 20 levels, players would need to overcome a variety of challenges before finally facing off against the boss of the game, Saddam Hussein. Operation Desert Storm was a fairly simple title, and from a contemporary perspective looked almost like an early 90s shareware title in terms of its graphics and gameplay. Despite its simplicity though, it sold surprisingly well, at least for a brand new game development studio, with 2,500 copies sold shortly after release. Interestingly, because Bungie was still effectively a one-person operation, the act of packaging and shipping the game would fall to Alex Seropian himself, as he spent hours holed up in his bedroom, putting discs into boxes, adding in the required documentation and game manuals, and then, finally, shipping those boxes to individuals who purchased the title. After shipping Operation Desert Storm, Seropian didn't have any other games ready to release, and in fact, he had spent so much time working on getting Bungie stood up as a company that he didn't even have any games on the list for an eventual release. Seropian knew that for his company to be successful, he'd need to regularly release games to the market, and at this point, he considered that the best way to maintain a regular release cadence would be to expand the company. The only issue was, Seropian didn't have a ton of capital to go off and hire other programmers. If he was going to expand the company's staff, he'd need to leverage pre-existing relationships rather than job postings. Luckily for Seropian, he knew a guy that he thought would make a perfect addition to the company, that being his former college mate Jason Jones. Jones, like we talked about, had always been interested in developing games, and prior to college, he had even created a prototype for a multiplayer action title that for the last few years had been sitting on a proverbial shelf gathering dust. As Jones continued his coursework at the University of Chicago, he began to consider that now would be a good time to revisit that prototype and potentially turn it into a full-fledged commercial game. He was in the process of building out that prototype when Alex Seropian reached out to him with a proposal. If Jones would agree to publish his forthcoming game through Bungie, then Seropian would handle all of the marketing and design work, hopefully leading to increased sales and potentially a path for Jones to break into the video game industry. Jones thought this sounded like a dream come true, so he agreed to work with Seropian to publish the evolution of his original 1988 prototype, which would come to be known as Minotaur: The Labyrinths of Crete. Minotaur would be published by Bungie in 1992 for the Apple Macintosh computer platform, and much like Seropian's game Operation Desert Storm, would receive a fair amount of attention for what amounted to an amateur game developer's first commercial title. Minotaur would end up selling around 2,500 copies, and in the process would gain a fairly fervent fan base, despite the fact that it required a modem and an online connection to play, a technical requirement that was not yet pervasive across the industry. Still, Jones' first game and Bungie's second commercial title was successful enough to drive Seropian and Jones to enter into a deal to develop future titles together. And with that, Jones and Seropian officially became partners and formal co-founders of Bungie. As Jones and Seropian settled into their new working relationship, the two gravitated to different roles within the company. Seropian was a natural salesman, and despite having the technical skill set to code games himself, his true talent was in business and publicity. Jones, by contrast, was 100% a software developer and wanted to focus on coding games, not marketing them to potential consumers. With the two men taking on completely different but equally critical roles in the company, attention would shift on what their first game as true partners would end up being. Before we talk about that, though, we need to take a brief detour to address the fact that Bungie, unlike nearly every other game development studio of the time, intended to focus on creating games solely for the Apple Macintosh platform, a move that would effectively limit their market reach right out of the gate. By the time the early 90s had rolled around, Apple computers were known primarily as educational machines, making their way into countless school computer labs and libraries. And while there was plenty of software, educational and otherwise, available for the platform, Apple's market share paled in comparison to the IBM-compatible PC, which was the computer platform for home use. Most developers of the time chose to focus on the IBM-compatible PC market, with ports to other platforms like Apple's ecosystem being a secondary consideration rather than a primary goal. Bungie, by contrast, wanted to develop exclusively for the Apple Macintosh, a decision driven by the fact that both Seropian and Jones had pretty much only ever coded on Apple computers, and therefore knew that environment inside and out. They didn't see a need to shift that focus, as they considered the Apple-exclusive gaming market to be an untapped market, one that would hopefully enable Bungie to make a name for itself with less competition than they might otherwise face in the overcrowded PC space. That being said, the PC had a bunch of amazing games that were continually being released to the market, and while Seropian and Jones were 100% Apple developers, they still enjoyed and respected the titles released for other platforms. Which is why, when id Software released the first-person shooter Wolfenstein 3D in May of 1992, the duo at Bungie knew that things were about to change forever. Wolfenstein 3D wasn't the first-person shooter, but it was the game that put the FPS genre on the map, providing a viscerally violent pseudo-3D experience where players would be tasked with mowing down hordes of enemy soldiers in the hopes of eventually defeating Hitler and saving the world from Nazi domination. Wolfenstein 3D was an incredibly influential game across the entire gaming industry, and after its release, the first-person shooter genre would quickly begin to rise in popularity. Jones and Seropian both saw this as an opportunity, which is why Jones immediately sat down to begin creating his own 3D engine for use in a future title, programmed for the Apple Macintosh computer platform. We've talked about game engines before, and specifically, we've talked a fair amount about first-person shooter game engines, including their limitations and capabilities, as well as the underlying technology that made those engines possible. With Wolfenstein 3D, id Software's John Carmack created a fast, responsive engine that utilized two-dimensional maps and clever graphics processing tricks to create perspective-driven three-dimensional projections, creating the illusion of being able to navigate a 3D environment while still only using two-dimensional graphics. Meaning, Wolfenstein 3D, despite appearing to be a 3D world, contained no polygons, no volumetric solids, and no objects with true depth. Everything in the world consisted of flat surfaces, albeit displayed to create the feeling of three-dimensional visuals. The Wolfenstein 3D engine also had some technical limitations, such as flat-shaded floors and ceilings, no sloped walls or objects, the inability to create rooms on top of each other, and a singular light map that applied throughout a level, meaning every level was equally bright with no opportunity to use distinct light sources, dim areas, or anything that could add additional lighting nuance to a given stage. Despite those limitations, Wolfenstein 3D was unlike anything the industry had ever seen, and these limitations really only appear to be limitations when looking at the engine from a modern perspective. Back when the game was made, it was pretty much as advanced as it got. So, when Jones decided to create his own Wolfenstein 3D-inspired game engine, he knew he was going to face an uphill battle, especially as a current college student without unlimited free time on his hands. Still, throughout the majority of 1992, Jones dedicated himself to creating his own 3D engine, with the intention of converting Bungie's prior 2D Minotaur title into a three-dimensional experience, effectively creating a more advanced sequel that Seropian and Jones hoped would wow gamers. Over the course of the year, it quickly became apparent that converting Minotaur to 3D just wouldn't make a ton of sense, as there were certain game mechanics and features prevalent in the original title that wouldn't make sense in a first-person 3D experience. Rather than simply go ahead with a half-hearted effort, the duo decided to scrap the whole Minotaur conversion/sequel idea, and would instead create a brand new game using Jones' shiny new 3D engine. Design work on that new title would take place through the first half of 1993, with Jones working on level design, programming, and the overarching story, while Seropian handled publicity and production responsibilities, similar to how the Bungie duo collaborated on Minotaur's release a year prior. Unlike Minotaur, though, this new 3D game was dramatically more complex, especially from a graphical perspective, and it was readily apparent that Seropian and Jones didn't have the artistic talent to really create a visually impressive 3D title. Luckily, one of Jones' friends, a man named Colin Brent, was a talented artist, and he would end up working on the game's graphics and creature design, despite not being an actual Bungie employee, because Bungie had yet to be successful enough to actually hire staff outside of Seropian and Jones, who were still running the company with a steady supply of passion, not profits. Despite that fact, Brent contributed significantly to the game's graphics and art design, until finally, in mid-1993, Pathways into Darkness would be ready for release. Pathways into Darkness would present players with a first-person perspective, pseudo-three-dimensional world that in many ways would represent the state-of-the-art in first-person perspective game design, and nowhere is that more apparent than when looking at the game's graphics. Pathways into Darkness, for a 1993 first-person perspective title, is one seriously impressive-looking game, with high-quality texture-mapped environments and creatures that are all visually distinct and appear to be almost painterly in style, creating the feeling that you're playing a truly advanced game as opposed to the traditional pixely sprite-based graphics of many competing titles. Now, one of the reasons Pathways into Darkness was able to utilize such advanced for the time graphics was the fact that it was designed as a pseudo-action adventure role-playing game, with a much slower pace than pure first-person shooters, and a full menu and inventory system to allow you to explore environments, pick up items, and progress through the game's narrative. Still, despite the slower pace of gameplay than games like Wolfenstein 3D, Pathways into Darkness was an impressive title, and the fact that it was designed to run on any contemporary Macintosh computer without any visual degradation or slowdown was a testament to the quality of the game's engine and overall design. And those Macintosh gamers, by the way, ate the game up, as this was one of the first times that a Macintosh exclusive title would be able to compete with the massive IBM-compatible PC game library. Over 20,000 copies of the game would be sold after its release, which was good enough to become the third highest-selling Macintosh game of the year, behind legendary titles Myst and SimCity 2000, so Pathways into Darkness was certainly in good company from a sales perspective. Critically, the game would be lauded, and many publications would end up naming Pathways into Darkness as the best Macintosh game of the year, with gamers similarly praising the title's gameplay, graphics, and overall design. Pathways into Darkness, by all measures, was a success. And in fact, it was the first true commercially successful game for Bungie, who up to this point were still headquartered in Alex Seropian's apartment. With the success of Pathways into Darkness, Bungie would begin to receive widespread acclaim, and would also begin to make some real money, which allowed them to move out of Seropian's apartment and into an actual office space, while also beginning to hire additional employees beyond the two company co-founders. After 2 years in the business, Bungie was finally starting to become a quote-unquote real game development studio. As you might expect with any successful endeavor, Bungie's immediate attention was focused on creating a sequel to Pathways into Darkness, albeit with an enhanced game engine to more closely align with the advanced technology of the time, which in the world of first-person perspective titles was dominated by Doom, id Software's own evolution over their prior Wolfenstein 3D title. Doom impressed Bungie in much the same way as Wolfenstein 3D had previously, and they knew that if they wanted their next title to be a true successor to Pathways into Darkness, they would have to create a game engine capable of delivering state-of-the-art gameplay and graphics. As Bungie was working on the design for their game, they realized that a sequel to Pathways into Darkness didn't make nearly as much sense as creating a brand new game, along with a new engine to take advantage of the rapid advances in technology that were happening around the industry. This decision is what would ultimately lead to one of the most important games in Bungie's entire history, Marathon, being created. Marathon was designed as a science fiction first-person shooter, and would once again be developed exclusively for Apple's computer ecosystem. Intended to compete with other first-person shooters of the time like Doom, Marathon's engine would be designed to utilize fully texture-mapped surfaces, ceilings and floors of varying heights and sizes, dynamic lighting throughout every level, and, perhaps most innovatively, the inclusion of mouse look to aim your weaponry at the enemies you'd fight in each stage. Mouse look around this time was not even a thing, and Marathon would become one of the first titles in the entire computer game industry to use a mouse to explore, look around, and aim in a virtual 3D environment. Perhaps more important than its technical innovations, though, was the fact that Marathon would include a complex plot that players could experience as they played the game, with computer terminals dotted across each level that could be examined to learn more about the game's narrative and underlying lore, representing one of the first times that a true story was included in a first-person shooter title. Future games would leverage narrative first-person gameplay to great effect, like the venerable Half-Life series and, interestingly, Bungie's own Halo series, but Marathon represents one of the earliest examples of trying to weave a story with traditional first-person shooter gameplay. The fact that Marathon was a Macintosh exclusive made Apple gamers ecstatic, as they finally felt like they had a full-fledged blockbuster game to compete with the DOS games that had dominated the market, and not only could it compete with those games, it was also more advanced than many of those titles. Which is why, upon its release in late 1994, Marathon would become Bungie's highest-selling title to date, with over 100,000 copies sold in its first year of release, performance that was bolstered by the critical response to the title, which was, in a word, outstanding. Many critics praised the game, recognizing it as one of the best games ever made, and directly comparing it to id Software's Doom, with some even declaring, "Doom what?" A clear shot fired that effectively said gaming on a Mac was just as good, if not better, than on IBM-compatible devices, and further solidifying Bungie as a force to be reckoned with in the industry. In fact, Marathon's success was so great that for the first time in the company's history, Bungie was beginning to be noticed outside of Macintosh gaming circles, with press providing mainstream coverage of the game, even though it was exclusive to the Apple Macintosh computer platform. Bungie sensed that they were on the verge of something big, so they followed Marathon up with 2 sequels, creating a trilogy of Marathon games that would each best the previous one in terms of overall quality, design, and technical capabilities. Of those 3 games, the second in the series, Marathon 2 Durandal, would be significant, as it was the first time that a Bungie title would be ported to a non-Apple computer platform, as it would make its way to the Microsoft Windows ecosystem around a year after its Macintosh debut. Interestingly, Apple gamers were not happy about this change in direction for Bungie, who the Macintosh faithful had revered as one of their companies, a shining light in the otherwise dim world of Mac gaming. Consequently, Bungie received a ton of hate mail for their decision to port Marathon 2 to the Microsoft Windows platform, a decision that the company had made to attempt to expand their market footprint and hopefully earn greater profits to be able to make even better games in the future. Still, despite this very normal business-centric rationale, Mac gamers were not happy. Luckily for Bungie, the unhappiness amongst their fans did not impact sales of their titles, as each entry in the Marathon series would outsell the last, and with the profits made after the release of the third Marathon game, Marathon Infinity, Bungie set their sights on creating yet another first-person shooter, and another game that would compete directly with the latest and greatest game from id Software. Bungie's next game was going to compete against the fully realized 3D action first-person shooter, Quake. As he had done previously, Jason Jones sat down and began working on their forthcoming game's engine, only this time he would have some help, as Bungie had continued to expand their staff with each successive game release. Work on the engine and underlying game design would continue for several months, until finally Jones stepped away to look at their progress and came to an unexpected conclusion. Bungie's new first-person shooter was shaping up to be too much like Quake, and Jones was concerned that Bungie wasn't innovating enough to remain relevant in the industry. Undeterred, Jones came up with a new idea. What if Bungie could take the 3D technical capabilities of his new engine and apply it to a real-time strategy game as opposed to a first-person shooter? One that would include massive battles between a variety of different combat units, complete with a fully fleshed-out story and background lore, effectively representing an incredibly advanced concept for the still-evolving real-time strategy genre. The rest of Bungie's leadership team thought that the concept had merit, which is why Bungie's next first-person shooter title was scrapped in favor of creating a brand new 3D real-time strategy game, Myth: The Fallen Lords. Myth would be the first time Bungie worked on a true multi-platform release, meaning from the very beginning, they were designing Myth to release for both Macintosh and Windows computer platforms. While they had previously ported Marathon 2 to Windows, that particular port felt like a disappointment to the Bungie team, who believed that the overall quality was poorer than what they were capable of. Myth would allow Bungie to right that wrong, and they were determined to not make the same mistake again. After nearly 2 years of development, Myth: The Fallen Lords would release to the market and would instantaneously become a runaway hit, with many critics declaring the title as one of the best games of all time, while serving as an incredibly influential title for future real-time strategy titles to emulate. Myth would win a number of Best Game of the Year awards, a title that was inclusive of both Macintosh and Windows games because Myth was a true industry-wide sensation, selling hundreds of thousands of copies and almost single-handedly making Bungie's profits increase by over 2,000%, an astronomical success that thrust Bungie into the spotlight and garnered significant attention by gamers everywhere, regardless of what platform they might be playing on. With such success, Bungie decided it was time to expand yet again. The company would move into an even larger, more impressive office space, which would house the core team of Bungie employees and the company's leadership, while at the same time they decided that it might make sense to stand up a second development team with the intent of increasing the company's output beyond single sequential game releases. This desire to make multiple games concurrently while continuing to grow the company is what resulted in a brand new game development studio being stood up in San Jose, California, that being Bungie West. While the core team at Bungie would begin working on their next games, including a sequel to Myth and, perhaps more interestingly, a return to the first-person shooter genre which would eventually result in the creation of the Halo series, Bungie West began considering what their first game was going to be. The team at the studio, which had staffed up to around 12 total members, began to discuss their common interests, and here it became apparent that most members of the team had a fondness for Japanese-styled animated films and television shows, more commonly referred to as anime. Cyberpunk action titles like Ghost in the Shell and Akira dominated the discussion, and the team began to consider, what if they could make a game inspired by that cyberpunk anime aesthetic? A title with insane action, fluid gameplay, and a storyline that would feel right at home on the screens of Japan's movie theaters. That general concept would be refined over several follow-on discussions until finally, work on the game that would eventually be known as Oni officially began. With Oni, the team at Bungie West was determined to deliver a third-person action experience unlike what anyone had experienced before. We have talked about beat-em-up titles before, and the general shift from their two-dimensional roots into fully realized 3D gameplay mechanics. But even with the most complex of those standard beat-em-up experiences, all moves, combo maneuvers, and strikes were effectively pre-canned individual actions, each one having a discrete beginning, middle, and end of the maneuver. When you executed a specific move in one of those games, that move would execute until it completed, without much, if any, possibility to deviate from that action. The team at Bungie West wanted to take things a bit further, and conceptualized a combat system where players had access to a variety of grapples, strikes, dodges, and movement-based actions that, unlike other beat-em-up games, would allow for incredibly smooth and fluid transitions from one move to the next, where the actual act of combat would become almost like a ballet of destruction. Designed to reward persistence and skill, the combat engine would allow talented players to string together moves without any appreciable break in the action, creating what felt like a continuous stream of attacks and counterattacks, similar to what you'd see in blockbuster action films of the time. Bungie West thought this would make for a truly unique game, so they went off to build the game's engine in earnest, combining the previously mentioned combat framework with a graphic style that mimicked Japanese animation, with high contrast colors combining with artistic renditions of player and non-player characters, while also weaving in a narrative that, similar to Marathon, would be told to players via in-game computer terminals that interested individuals could access and read. Also furthering the game's story would be in-game cutscenes, which would once again be designed to give players an anime-fueled look into the game's world and its characters. Bringing the game's music to life would fall to composers Martin O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore, a duo of musicians who had previously composed the music for Myth: The Fallen Lords and its sequel, Myth 2: Soulblighter, as well as techno music production company Power of Seven, which had composed roughly half of the music for Oni prior to O'Donnell and Salvatore joining the project. Between O'Donnell, Salvatore, and the pre-existing work by Power of Seven, the music for Oni would be composed over a period of several months, with the majority of tracks containing electronic techno-styled beats and instrumentation to convey the fast-paced action that the team was hoping to deliver with the game. Work on Oni was proceeding on plan with a successful showing at the 1999 Electronics Entertainment Expo, or E3, where Oni would win the award for Best Action Adventure title, with an expected final ship date in the fourth quarter of that same year. Only here, things would start to take a bit of a wrong turn, as work on the project began to face unexpected difficulties, resulting in several schedule delays and ultimately putting Bungie in a difficult position. Because, in June of the year 2000, Microsoft announced that it would be purchasing Bungie and making Bungie's forthcoming first-person shooter, Halo, an Xbox console exclusive. Now, you might be thinking, why would Microsoft buying Bungie have a negative impact on the creation of Oni? Well, the answer to that lies in the fact that prior to Bungie being acquired by Microsoft, rival publisher Take-Two Interactive had invested in the company and in fact owned 20% of Bungie at the time of its Microsoft acquisition. As part of the terms of the purchase, all of the work related to Oni would transfer to Take-Two Interactive after the acquisition was 100% finalized, which would have meant Bungie would lose out on any potential profits associated with that title's eventual release. Not wanting to lose that opportunity, work on Oni proceeded at a rapid pace, with certain features like a planned multiplayer mode having to be scrapped entirely in the interest of completing the game as quickly as possible. After a period of renewed attention and focus, development of Oni would finally complete, and the game would release on the Microsoft Windows, Mac OS, and PlayStation 2 platforms in 2001. Upon its release, Oni was met with a tepid critical response, a far cry from Bungie's more celebrated titles, as many publications declared the game to be a bit underdeveloped, with less detailed environments than its competitors, questionable artificial intelligence, and a plot that, at times, didn't make a whole lot of sense. Despite that criticism, though, most reviewers praised the game's overall gameplay, and the unique combat system that allowed players to string together ridiculous combinations of moves was frequently cited as a major selling point of the title. All told, Oni would only sell a bit over 50,000 copies, a fairly dramatic drop from Bungie's current sales expectations. Oni, despite the best of intentions by its development team, appeared to have fallen a bit flat with critics and gamers alike. That said, there was some early work completed for a potential sequel, but that project was eventually cancelled without much fanfare, leaving Oni as a standalone release in what would end up being Bungie West's only game before it ceased to exist. Despite Oni's relative lack of success, it did amass a contingent of fans who became enamored with the title, some of whom decided to take it upon themselves to improve the game and add in a number of bug fixes and enhancements for the title, including the addition of mod support whereby future talented fans could add in brand new features to the game if they so desired. This fan-based work would result in the release of the 7th Anniversary Edition, named as it was because it didn't officially become available until 7 years after Oni had originally released. This new edition continues to be iterated on, with numerous additions added over the years, and a bunch of additional enhancements and fixes still to come in the future. Oni may not have had a prolonged retail presence, but with talented fans around to keep the game alive, it continues to maintain a place in various gaming communities, even today. While Oni would end up not having much of a legacy, the company behind its creation, Bungie, would continue to have an impact on the computer and video game industry that continues to be felt around the world. Bungie would be responsible for a number of incredibly successful and influential titles over the years that would follow its acquisition by Microsoft, including the creation of the Halo and Destiny series, both of which continue to remain in the gaming spotlight even today. While Bungie itself is now owned by Sony Interactive Entertainment following a $3.6 billion acquisition in 2022, it continues to create multi-platform titles today, with one of its next major releases intended to be a remake of its early first-person shooter classic, Marathon, for all modern gaming platforms. It remains to be seen how a modern reimagining of that title will be received, but Bungie's track record is pretty darn good, so I have no doubt it'll get its fair share of attention when it eventually releases next year. As for Bungie's co-founders, Alex Seropian would eventually leave the company in 2004 to create a new game development studio, Wide Load Games, which would eventually be acquired by Disney in 2009, with Seropian being promoted to lead Disney's in-house development team, Disney Interactive Studios. Seropian would eventually leave Disney in 2012 and would spend the next decade standing up a couple of other game studios, with his most recent venture, Look North World, focused on creating specialized islands for the incredibly popular Epic Games title Fortnite. Jason Jones would end up staying with Bungie, and today is the company's Chief Creative Officer, a position he holds due to the extensive innovations that he spearheaded across nearly all of Bungie's releases from the point of its creation all the way through to today. With Jones at the creative helm of the company, I have no doubt that Bungie will continue to see success in the future, and I, for one, am very interested in seeing what future releases Bungie has in store for gamers around the world. Oni holds an interesting place in video game history. As the only game ever released by Bungie West, it has become somewhat of a forgotten title nowadays, outside of the core group of talented fans keeping the game alive and updated for all of us to enjoy. I'll relay my own personal opinion of the title in just a little bit, but suffice it to say that Oni is certainly a title that should not be overlooked as we examine the history of the industry we all know and love. It may not have the same legacy as its grandparent company, but that in no way diminishes what Bungie West strived to do with the title, which was to create a unique, action-packed gaming experience where players could participate in free-flowing combat the likes of which had rarely been seen in a 3D beat-em-up style title. Despite being a singular standalone release, Oni will undoubtedly remain a cherished experience for fans of the title, and as such is certainly a game that will be remembered fondly for years to come. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Oni today versus when it was released back in 2001. At its core, Oni is a third-person, three-dimensional, multi-stage action title, which, if taken at face value, means Oni sounds like some generic 3D action game that became pervasive across the video and computer game industry in the early 2000s. But to assume that description is all Oni offers is a very reductive assumption, and as we'll see, Oni is in fact incredibly unique in the world of 3D action titles. So let's talk about Oni and the broad framework that makes up the foundations of the game. The first thing to mention is the fact that Oni is designed around the concept of an integrated campaign that covers 14 total levels, or 15 if you count the very first tutorial stage. There is no open world gameplay here, though each level that you end up fighting through is fairly large, giving the impression that the game world is actually a fair bit larger than what it actually is. Part of that is driven by the fact that many of the levels were designed using real-world architectural plans, with real-world architects creating the designs for those stages. What that means is that when you're making your way through a series of airport terminals, it will feel very much like you're making your way through a series of airport terminals, which for anyone who has ever traveled before, you likely recognize that an airport can be a pretty large environment. Well, that size is reflected fairly accurately in Oni, which is a nice real-world touch in what is otherwise a bit of a futuristic anime-inspired experience. As you make your way through those real-world inspired stages, you'll end up taking on a fairly large assortment of enemies, each of which has particular strengths and weaknesses. Take, for example, the brute known as Tanker. As you might expect given his name, he relies mostly on power moves, like picking you up and tossing you around like a ragdoll, or punching you relentlessly with haymaker kinds of attacks. Contrast his moveset with the ninjas you encounter in later levels, who are all agile and quick, with less powerful moves but more damaging throws and martial arts kinds of maneuvers, and you'll quickly see that there's a fair bit of variety here, and that's not even to mention all of the other enemy types that represent hybrids of those two extremes. It definitely keeps the action fresh, having to deal with the variety of enemies the game throws at you, though if I were to levy a critique against the title, I was a little disappointed that some of the later enemy types were simply color palette swaps, or slight model variations of earlier enemies. I know that using palette swaps was a very common thing to do in beat-em-up titles from the 80s and 90s, but I kinda wished there was even greater variety in the late game enemies. It's not a huge deal, but it is something I noticed. Regardless of that enemy diversity, one thing is certain. Each and every fight will revolve around one of two types of combat, either hand-to-hand battle or gunplay-based firefights. And here, we need to take some time to talk about both, because combat is probably the core feature of the game that serves to make it unique from other 3D action titles that you may have played. And the most unique aspect of that combat is undoubtedly the hand-to-hand fighting system. In most games, you have a series of attacks mapped to different buttons that you may press, with some games using multiple buttons for different types of punches and kicks, like high versus low strikes, while often allowing for combination moves to be executed by inputting some sequence of directional movements and punch and kick button presses, and oftentimes figuring out the right situation to use each of those moves represents the main gameplay loop of the entire fighting experience. And in this regard, Oni is somewhat analogous to that kind of fighting system, in that you can execute a series of punches, kicks, and combination moves to fight and hopefully defeat your opponents. What makes Oni unique, though, is the sheer degree of agency you have over your movement and combat maneuvers, as you effectively have complete control over your body, allowing you to string together moves with a level of fluidity that most games simply cannot capture. To illustrate why that is, we need to take a look at how movement is handled in the game, as well as how fighting inputs translate into in-game action. Moving around in Oni is accomplished using your keyboard in a standard WASD kind of configuration for walking forward and backwards and strafing from side to side, while looking around a stage and making normal turns is accomplished by using your mouse in a third-person mouse look kind of setup. The simple act of navigating a stage feels pretty darn good, and you always feel like you have 100% control over your character, as long as your feet are on the ground. Movement goes beyond simply running around on the ground though, as you can also crouch with your shift key to reduce your movement speed and the noise you generate while walking, while also being able to jump in the air by pressing your spacebar. If you need to get somewhere in a hurry, you can also double tap forward to execute a sprint, while pressing shift and a direction at the same time will initiate a dodge in whatever direction you're pressing. Combat, meanwhile, is accomplished by clicking your left mouse button to punch and your right mouse button to kick, which honestly doesn't sound all that exciting. And really, none of the controls we've gone over so far have sounded particularly unique, so you might be asking, how is Oni actually a unique action experience? Well, the answer to that lies in how all of those different movement and combat mechanics combine together in the middle of a fight, which, when everything goes the way you want it to, feels legitimately like you're controlling Neo or Trinity from the Matrix. I'll paint you a picture. You walk into a large reception area without any equipment other than your fists and your feet. Across the distance, you see 3 guards, one of which has a gun, and unfortunately, those guards notice you before you have a chance to plan your attack. As gunfire peppers your general location, you race behind a nearby pillar, hoping that you can single out some of the guards to improve your chances of survival. The guard with the gun ends up being faster than the other 2 guards, who are also in pursuit. That gun-wielding enemy knows you're hiding behind a nearby pillar, so he charges forward with the intent of shooting you and ruining your day. So you lie in wait, and just as soon as the guard turns the corner of the pillar, you press left and kick, which executes a side kick right to the guard's head, knocking him down and disarming him in the process. As that guard falls to the ground, you decide to execute a flying stomp attack, so you jump in the air and press the shift key, which causes you to flip in midair and land on the guard's stomach, damaging him even further as he lies there helpless. At the same time, though, the two other guards who were in pursuit have arrived at your location, and they want nothing more than to knock you out. Quickly, you turn around and run into the closest guard, pressing your punch button in combination with forward momentum, which causes you to grab onto the guard's neck and swing around in the air, cranking his neck with a satisfying snap as he falls down to the ground. The next guard, meanwhile, prepares to attack, and recognizing he's unleashing a series of standard, albeit quick moves, you simply stand there and absorb the blows, blocking each swing before the guard tires himself out and needs a bit of a breather. At that moment, you take advantage of the situation and duck down, holding shift and pressing your kick button to execute a standing leg sweep, knocking that guard to the ground while at the same time causing residual damage to the other nearby guard as your foot hits both at the same time. While you were dealing with those other two guards, though, the original gun-wielding guard has recovered, and unfortunately for you, he's retrieved his gun and is about to shoot you in the back. You notice this and quickly press your back key in combination with your punch button, which executes a reverse elbow strike that lands squarely on the guard's nose, causing him to drop his pistol as he slinks down to the ground once again, needing time to recover. As that guard gets taken out of the fight temporarily, the other two guards you'd been fighting get back to their feet, and they both charge at you at the same time. Recognizing the danger in the situation, you crouch down and inputting a specific combination of arrow presses in conjunction with your kick button, you unleash the deadly Devil Spin Kick combo move, which is effectively a super roundhouse kick that whips around and kicks both guards' chins, knocking them into each other and, in the process, knocking them entirely out of the fight. At this point, the gun-wielding guard has recovered, but this time, you're ready, as you charge the guard and jump, hitting your kick button in midair, which executes a flying kick that connects with the guard's face and sends him down to the ground once and for all. You think the coast is clear, only to discover yet another guard closing in on your position. Thinking quickly, you reach down to pick up the prior guard's gun, and in one smooth motion, you aim down the barrel of the weapon and fire off 5 consecutive shots at the rushing guard, filling him with lead and putting him out of commission permanently. With the coast finally clear and no immediate danger in your immediate vicinity, you take the time to use a stim pack to heal up before entering a nearby office that's just off the reception area. You don't know what you're going to find, but you know you'll be ready for any enemy who is stupid enough to get in your way. The battle I just described might sound like some hypothetical scene from an action movie, but the fact is that this exact situation happened to me while playing Oni, and I managed to pull off the exact sequence of moves and combat tactics that I just discussed, and it felt absolutely awesome. I don't know that I have ever played a game where I had so much autonomy and control over my character, and the sheer variety of throws, punches, kicks, combo moves, and evasive maneuvers makes Oni an incredibly unique 3D fighting experience that feels almost analogous to a really deep one-on-one fighting game, with the main difference being you are in fact fighting many enemies at once the majority of the time. When things coalesce into a ballet of martial arts expertise and flying bullets, you feel like an unstoppable action hero with a chip on your shoulder and evil intent in your heart, and it is a really empowering, visceral feeling. That being said, things don't always come together the way you may plan. For one, the shooting mechanics in the game are a bit of a mixed bag. There are a variety of guns that span traditional bullet-based weapons, energy rifles, electric stun guns, rocket launchers, and pretty much everything in between, and I appreciated the weapon diversity prevalent throughout the title. But the actual act of shooting those weapons can be a hit or miss kind of situation, more frequently landing in the miss column, literally, as targeting with most weapons uses a reticle range as opposed to a more accurate crosshair kind of setup. This translates into a shooting experience where you never really know if you're going to land your shot, and when you combine the inaccurate shooting with the fact that enemies move around pretty quickly and actively try to avoid being shot, which, by the way, they absolutely should do, you end up with a situation that is marginally useful in only very specific situations. Because of the mediocre gunplay, I found that I often avoided using most weaponry throughout my playthrough, though I did use the sniper energy rifle whenever I got the chance, and at the end of the game, the scream rifle became an absolute favorite, which fires out a homing beacon of energy that absolutely wrecks enemies, assuming they don't move out of its area of effect radius. Unlike the shooting mechanics, the act of hand-to-hand combat is a mostly fun and engaging experience, though it too has some flaws that can crop up as you combat the various enemies you'll encounter in the game. The biggest issue from my perspective is the randomness with which blocks are executed in the midst of combat. Blocking in Oni is automatic, as long as you're not moving around or trying to attack yourself, and in theory, this sounds like it'd work fine. The issue is, in the heat of battle, you really don't want to be standing still, especially if you see a guard in the distance with a firearm of some kind, which in Oni is an absolute death sentence. You know how I mentioned that gunplay is a bit of a mixed bag for you, the player? Well, for the computer-controlled characters, they may as well be expert-level marksmen, because they do not miss, and they will unleash hell fury upon you if you happen to be standing around while they have you in their crosshairs. The good news is that you can find energy shields throughout each level that provide shielding against weaponry, but the bad news is, those too get depleted pretty quickly if you end up getting shot by an enemy. Worse than that is if you're surrounded by a couple of gun-wielding foes, in which case, you better hope you have some stimpaks, because if not, you are going to die. Anyway, gun-toting enemies aside, trying to block in combat is simply inconsistent, as sometimes an enemy's attack will be successfully blocked, as you might expect, while 10 seconds later, that same enemy might try to execute that same attack, and he or she will hit you and knock you down to the ground. I honestly don't know what the criteria is for a successful block, and while I recognize that certain attacks are unblockable, I don't know why blockable attacks would change from one moment to the next. I'm assuming it has something to do with some misunderstood input that's causing the blocks to not register, to which I say, a better approach than assuming no inputs means you want to block would be to have a dedicated block button that you could choose to press or not, depending on the situation. I believe that would have made blocking much more straightforward and understandable than the system that's actually in place in the game. Putting blocking aside, the rest of the combat is not without some minor issues, primarily related to your ability to target your enemies and hit them effectively. Unlike many 3D titles, Oni has no lock-on targeting mechanic at all, which in some ways is a good thing as it lets combat be free-flowing and more cinematic, especially when fighting multiple enemies. On the other hand, hitting enemies can sometimes be a bit challenging, which I'm chalking up to the fact that Oni is a relatively early 3D action title when compared to the advancements in the genre that would be implemented in the years following its release. I think Oni did a lot right, and I'm legitimately curious why other developers haven't taken Oni's combat system and attempted to improve upon it, because what's here is legitimately fun and engaging, especially when everything works the way you want it to. It's just not a 100% smooth experience, and I believe a modern take on the title would be a sight to behold. We've spoken a lot about the combat, because like I said, that's the element of the game that allows Oni to most distinguish itself from other 3D action titles. But of course, the game itself is more than just a series of combat-oriented encounters. The world of Oni and the underlying story is very obviously inspired by anime, and while I don't personally watch a ton of anime in my spare time, I can appreciate the aesthetics and themes that Oni implemented. Those themes are used effectively in the various levels, weaponry, characters, and plot points that you encounter as you play the game, and I thought the in-game terminals that provided some additional lore and story exposition were a nice touch to help further your understanding of the game's narrative, which can at times become a bit convoluted. It's never distracting though, and by the end of the game, you'll feel like you just experienced a pretty interesting, if not over-the-top, sci-fi futuristic adventure. I certainly have more thoughts about the more specific aspects of the game, but we're going to talk about those in just a little bit. First though, as we always do, we have to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Now, Oni is a little bit of a later title, so it's not like we had absolutely no internet or information available to us like we might have had with some of our earlier titles, but regardless, I still like looking at the box, because even with that information, a lot of times when we made a buying decision in the gaming stores, that decision was based on what the box looked like. Did the front of the box make the game seem cool? If so, flip it over. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might buy it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Oni, for the Microsoft Windows computer platform, the back of the box says, an intense action thriller comes to life with exciting anime-style characters and storyline. Revolutionary gameplay blend of hand-to-hand and weapons combat. Easy-to-learn fighting system with cool lifelike moves. Arsenal of weapons includes pistols, rocket launchers, energy, and projectile weapons. And then this is one of those boxes that has a fold-out in the front that has some additional information, and it says, her only future is to avenge the past. And then a couple of quotes. PC Gamer says, "We can't wait for this game." And CGW says, "Oni is one of the freshest approaches to the 3D shooter we have ever seen." And then there are a bunch of screenshots, one of which is captioned with the phrase "Devil Spin Kick," which represents one of the special moves in the game. And that is pretty much it. There are a ton of graphics here that are not necessarily in the game. So basically the box is stylized very anime-centric. There's a bunch of anime artwork on the box, and then kind of over top of that are some screenshots from the in-game action. And I've got to say, I don't know that this box sold me on the game. The reason for that is, like I said, I am not a big anime guy. I don't know that I would have ever picked up the game box to even look at it unless somebody actually went to me and recommended the game to me to actually be something to play. Because, like I said, the box is very anime-centric. I would have probably looked at the box and thought, oh, that artwork looks cool, and then just continued looking for other games, because anime is not something that I personally seek out. If you feel otherwise, if you're into anime, this would have definitely been a box for you, because you would have walked by it on the store shelf, you would have seen it and thought, oh, wait a second, this looks really cool, an anime computer game? Then you pick it up, you flip it over, and then you would have actually seen some of the martial arts maneuvers and things like that. But the fact is that the box just doesn't convey how good the combat is. And that really is the crux of the game. And unfortunately, at least for me, the box does not sell that aspect of the experience. You really have to play the game to get that experience. So this box, for me, doesn't really do it, but I can certainly see if somebody is more keen on anime than what I am, this could have definitely sold someone. Anyway, we're going to move on to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. Oni is very obviously an earlier 3D title, and as such, the visuals you see throughout the game are reminiscent of any similar title developed around the late 90s into the early 2000s, with very angular polygonal structures and characters, texture map visuals, and generally speaking, clean-looking environments, where most textures are fairly simple without a ton of extra detail that would become popular in later years, like bump mapping or other techniques that add depth to textures and visuals. These graphics, while pleasing to look at, really do feel like they're showing their age a bit, as nobody would mistake Oni's visuals for a modern title. There's just too much of a disparity between these early 3D accelerated visuals and the quality of graphics on display in pretty much any modern title. I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with the graphics in the game, as I actually think the environments in particular look pretty darn good, with unique 3D spaces that truly do feel like real-world locations they're meant to represent. And character artwork, while a bit primitive by today's standards, are all varied and are distinct enough to allow you to know whether you're fighting a more power-driven enemy, an agile martial artist, or a defensive tank-like character, which is appreciated. I'm just saying that the overall graphical style is showing its age, as is the case with nearly all 3D-based titles from the early 2000s. It's not a critique, it's more of just an objective observation. Animations, meanwhile, all look pretty darn good, and in particular, all of the fight-based moves and combinations are animated extremely well. Similar to the overall visuals, animations aren't quite as smooth as what we're accustomed to with modern titles today, but for an early 2000s title, Oni's animations are pretty much top-notch. I also need to mention the general graphical anime style that pervades the entire experience, which from my perspective is actually an awesome aesthetic in the game, even coming from someone who doesn't frequently watch anime, and I actually thought that could have been explored even more within the framework of the game. Sure, the opening and ending cinematics are effectively ripped right out of an anime movie, and those look amazing. But in the game itself, I kind of wished the graphics were closer to the true anime-styled visuals that you might see in a real anime television show or movie, or even matched the anime stylings that were on the box, because that kind of visual experience would have been incredible. I'm sure there were technical limitations at play that prevented the game from truly looking like an interactive anime adventure, because the game itself does display various anime-inspired influences throughout each level, item, weapon, and character. I'm just thinking about how amazing an interactive anime title would be, complete with an evolved version of Oni's fight controls and mechanics, and I gotta tell you, even for someone who doesn't watch anime, in my head that still sounds like a multi-million-dollar idea. Wishful thinking aside, Oni for the most part looks really good, and I think that even modern gamers will find a lot to appreciate with the game's visuals. Moving on to the sound and music, the music in Oni is simply phenomenal, with an amazing mix of various techno-inspired and beat-heavy tracks that really make you want to fight hordes of enemies and roundhouse kick them into oblivion. As I played through the game, the music constantly reminded me of various scenes from the Matrix film series, and in case you're wondering, that was 100% a good thing, as it made me feel like even more of a skilled martial artist dispatching armies of bad guys. Bottom line, the music sounds amazing, and from my perspective, is definitely one of the overall highlights of the game. Sound effects, meanwhile, all sound great and mesh really well with the action on the screen, which I appreciated. Voice acting, however, was a bit of a mixed bag for me. Most of the dialogue in the game sounded pretty darn good and believable with a decidedly anime flair to it. Other dialogue, though, seemed to veer too far into caricature territory for me, which may have been a stylistic choice by the game's designers, but was not something that appealed to me personally. This, I recognize, is a purely subjective thing, as there was nothing technically wrong with the voice acting in the game. It's just that I prefer voice work that is a bit more nuanced, or if you're going to go over the top with something, really go over the top with it. It felt like some of Oni's voice work went halfway between trying too hard and over-the-top performance, which for me, just didn't hit the mark. Overall, though, that's a relatively minor complaint, as the majority of the game's auditory environment was simply excellent, and like I said, the music? Absolutely killer soundtrack. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Oni, you play as a genetically augmented police officer codenamed Konoko, a member of the Technological Crimes Task Force, or TCTF. The TCTF has been tasked by the governing authority for the entirety of Earth, the World Coalition government, with maintaining order in the wake of global chaos, as the future setting that the game takes place in is unfortunately a world filled with environmental pollution that threatens civilization each and every day. You begin the story as a dutiful TCTF agent, though you soon discover that the TCTF has been keeping secrets from you, both related to your genetically enhanced abilities, as well as information about your family and heritage. Over the course of the game, you'll uncover a secretive plot involving human genetic experimentation, learn more about your family and the origins of your abilities, and, hopefully, stop a worldwide terrorist organization hell-bent on polluting the entire world. It's up to you to save society as you know it, or die trying. So this story, I'm kinda conflicted here. On one hand, I actually really enjoyed the setup, the plot, the twists, and the overarching narrative, which I thought really worked well within the context of the game's framework and ultimately provided strong plot points to progress through as you played the game. On the other hand, I felt like some of the plot and narrative was either rushed or perhaps missing entirely, which made things feel a tad disjointed to me. What was here was good, and I actually wanted to learn more about what was going on in the game world. But it felt like there was some implied knowledge about different events, or perhaps things were glossed over a bit too much for the entire story to really shine. It's a testament to the quality of the narrative concepts that I wanted more from the game, but unfortunately, what we got felt only partially fleshed out. This is definitely an area that I thought could have been expanded upon. I know Bungie was trying to create a more action-oriented experience, which I can respect. But if you're going to include a bunch of narrative in an action title, you have to either keep it super light, or you should go deep and really go for it. It felt like Oni straddled the line between the two, and as a result, missed the mark a bit, at least for me. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked extensively about the game's controls and the combat system in the game, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I do want to discuss, though, are a few of the other design decisions that contribute to the overall playability of the title. First, though, just to reiterate, the fighting system in the game and the corresponding controls are both pretty darn amazing, at least when they work. Could they have been refined a bit? Sure. And could the gunplay have been tightened up? Absolutely. But the fact is, Oni is an entirely unique experience when it comes to three-dimensional fighting controls in an exploration-focused 3D action game. And as such, I've got to give it props for trying something that very few, if any, games have tried before or since. Putting the revolutionary combat system aside, though, I do have some critiques about some other aspects of the game. And to start, let's talk about the game's save point and checkpointing system. Like we talked about, Oni contains 14 different levels to play through, and within those individual levels, progress is saved using a semi-hidden checkpoint-based system, meaning it's not like you need to activate anything in-game to save your progress. The game simply checks whether you've progressed to a certain point in the level, and if you did, the game will save your progress automatically. That sounds good in theory, but in practice, can be a bit frustrating to experience. The issue is that each stage only has 3 or 4 checkpoints to activate, and most levels are fairly large with a number of enemy encounters, some of which can be pretty challenging. What this means is that you will often face situations where you need to progress through challenging encounters multiple times in the hopes of reaching the next checkpoint and saving your progress. Now you might be thinking, well, big deal, a lot of games have a similar kind of mechanic. To which I would reply, yes, they do. The issue here, though, is that every aspect of progress in a given stage is saved at those checkpoints, including your stim pack count and your health meter. So let's take a look at a hypothetical example. You're making your way through a stage, and you've just gotten past a really challenging set of fights, during which you had to use up all of your stim packs just to survive, and even using a bunch of those healing items, you're still left with just a sliver of health. You might think that finding the next checkpoint in the level would be a boon, because then you don't have to repeat those challenging fights again. But let's say you hit a checkpoint, and you're nearly immediately dropped into a room with another 1 or 2 enemies to fight, one of which, let's assume, has a gun. Well, you've just effectively gotten into a situation that is nearly impossible to progress past, because you don't have the resources or the hit points to survive even approaching the armed enemy, since he will fire on you almost immediately, killing you. Your only recourse at this point is to reload a prior checkpoint and hopefully manage your resources and hit points more effectively in order to better prepare for that post-checkpoint encounter. I'm not saying this kind of thing happens often, as many levels contain plenty of healing, shielding, and other items to keep you topped up as you move from battle to battle. But there are a few levels that are for some reason dramatically more challenging than others, which likely will cause you a bit of frustration as you make your way, unsuccessfully, from encounter to encounter. As a computer game, it feels a little out of place to not be able to save anywhere, and at any time, which is a core component of many computer titles that have been released since the dawn of the computer game industry. I'm not suggesting Oni is the only title to implement this kind of checkpoint-based system. I am saying, though, that I didn't particularly enjoy this kind of checkpoint-based system. The other issue that kinda plays into this is that every single level is treated like a discrete experience, meaning you do not carry forward any items, weapons, hit points, or shields from one level to the next. You always start out with no weapon and with no stim packs in your inventory. This is a bit of a punch in the gut occasionally, as there are some levels where you'll have more stim packs than you know what to do with, and it would have been a literal game changer to be able to carry those stim packs with you from one level to the next. Because of the difficulty spikes prevalent in certain stages, and the need to start from square one in every single level, the game can sometimes feel like a bit of an artificial challenge, especially when you consider that sometimes the controls and combat system just do not work in your favor. A couple of tweaks to the overall design could have addressed the situation entirely, and if the game ever gets the full-on remake treatment, I'd encourage the developers to take a look at some of those design decisions and make some modifications. The other major critique I have against the game's playability has to do with the platforming that's prevalent in many stages, as well as the incredibly dangerous platforms that you'll be doing a lot of your fighting on. Like we talked about, Oni's environments are pretty cool looking, and part of many of those environments' designs include a good degree of verticality. And like many games, should you fall from a high height, you will 100% die. Now, in the earlier stages, you'll only encounter a couple of situations where the catwalks you're traversing are dangerously narrow, and even then, the only real issue is if you get attacked by an enemy while you're trying to cross them, which will almost certainly be a death sentence, unless you push them to their death first. But in the later game, some of those platforming sequences become incredibly tricky, and when you add in challenging fights against multiple enemies, all while suspended high above the ground, you have a recipe for death. Then, when you consider that the falling death you just experienced might in fact push you pretty far back in the stage you've just been playing because of the game's checkpoint system, you'll likely get pretty irritated, at least until you cool down, regroup yourself, and try to get through the stage one more time. I will say I did experience several moments of pretty high frustration because of the combination of all of these mechanics and design decisions, but at the same time, those frustrations were never enough to turn me off from the game. All they did was make me redouble my efforts and my focus to hopefully succeed during my next playthrough of a given level. It made for a slightly uneven, somewhat irritating experience at times, but ultimately, the good stuff and the unique aspects of the game far outweighed any of these criticisms. And the fact is, when everything Oni offers works the way you expect and want it to, the game feels absolutely joyous to play, and offers a degree of visceral combat and action that is honestly hard to top. I can't recall the last time I felt so in control of my combat actions, with what felt like true autonomy to attack, defend, and avoid in whatever manner I felt was warranted given the situation I found myself in. Like I described earlier, some fights can feel unbelievably awesome, and several of those moments have formed permanent memories in my brain simply because of how epic it felt. That is not a feeling you get from many games. That said, there's also the other side of the coin, which is when Oni introduces a bit of jank to its formula, all bets are off, and you're likely going to be met with some unavoidable frustration that serves to detract a bit from the overall experience. To reiterate, the good does outweigh the bad here, but I would be lying if I said Oni was an entirely smooth, frustration-free experience. So what is our verdict on Oni? Well, the game is both a unique and highly entertaining title, as well as one that on occasion can feel a bit unfair and potentially too challenging for its own good, through no real fault of your own. You can definitely develop enough proficiency to counter most of the game's challenges, but occasionally, there will be nothing you can do, other than die and start over and hope that your next run is more successful. That said, there is a ton to like here, and the combat system is something I wish was replicated and improved upon in other games. The fact that Oni is one of the few games to give you this amount of freeform control over your combat moves is commendable, and certainly deserves to be recognized and experienced by anyone with even a passing interest in 3D action titles. Which is why, for me, Oni has just become the newest addition to our list of golden oldies. It doesn't quite hit Pantheon level for me, mostly because of the occasional frustrations I've noted already, but I still think everyone needs to give Oni a try at least once in their gaming careers, if only to experience the combat system that, like I said, I really wish would make its way to other titles. Whether that happens in the future or not, one thing I can say with absolute certainty is that Oni does a lot right, and it is certainly deserving of its status as the newest member in our collection of Golden Oldies. That was our episode on Oni. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Goemon's Great Adventure, otherwise known as Mystical Ninja 2, starring Goemon. This is another Patreon-sponsored episode. This one's coming from ISO, so I am definitely looking forward to talking about that one. If you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience, definitely let me know. And at the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. Though if that happens, awesome. It means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I am hitting the mark with the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community, and I want to continue to try to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Mystical Ninja 2 starring Goemon. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.